not be surprised if we found out that he was indeed motivated by ISIS or another Islamic extremist organization. I think that's where we're going to end up here. That would make it the most significant ISIS-inspired attack that we've had on our soil so far.
Prudence tells us to wait before knee-jerking, that every multiple killing in America is connected to terrorism and those connected with overseas thugs. But the events Thursday in Tennessee are forcing us to once again reconsider how we seek out the vermin who butcher based on religion and fanatical thinking. And it may yet force us to change our way of life in America in a manner that won't make the population happy one bit. Welcome back to the Hardline. The former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for New York, best known for leading the prosecution of the Blind Sheik. Also the author of Faithless Execution, Building the Political Case for Obama's Impeachment, Andrew McCarthy. And joined by the retired U.S. Army Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, also military advisor for Concerned Veterans of America, Scott Mann. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. And Andrew, I'm going to begin with you in a legal sense, and I'm going to try to tread carefully, but some things have got to be said. We are right back where we have been before. Someone coming out of nowhere, not necessarily on the radar. Lone wolf, whatever you want to call it, killing 4 innocent people, could have killed many more. Are we getting to a point where in order to fight and win this war against these terrorists, these killers, we are going to have to start bending civil liberties, and we're going to have to change the way we live in this country, whether we like it or not?
Well, Ed, there's always a tension between civil liberties and national security. That's just the nature of the beast. In times when we don't have a high security threat, we have fuller liberties. And, you know, in wartime and times that are like wartime, it's always been the case that those get constricted, but hopefully reasonably so. I think we could do a lot more than we're doing without really impinging on people's civil liberties in a material way. The thing that people don't want to come to grips with, including these statements that you just played from the administration, is that these are not ISIS-inspired attacks, even if it turns out that ISIS is involved in them. These are ideology-inspired attacks, and we continue to not want to focus on the big problem that we have, which is that this is a interpretation of Islam that, while not the only potential interpretation, is a mainstream one in the Middle East and one that has more adherents than we'd like to think in the West, and that's what we need to focus on.
Let me interrupt for a moment, though. Even though it is ideology, and you are correct, we've talked about it many times here, you said the phrase wartime. Do we have to realize that we are at war, no matter how you look at it? It may not be the conventional wars that we're used to in sending thousands of troops in, but if we're at war, don't we have to change our way of life, as much as we hate to do it, in order to keep ourselves a little safer?
Well, you know, we've been at war. The 1993 World Trade Center attack, as far as I'm concerned, was radical Islam's declaration of war against the United States. As far as they're concerned, the war has never stopped, and we certainly haven't won it. So I don't see how, when we have an enemy that's avidly making war against us, how we can come to any other conclusion that we are at war, whether we would like to be or not.
Lieutenant Colonel Mann, I know that may chafe at you as well, because certainly as someone who's been in the military, you fight for civil liberties for people here. You fight for what we have in America. But this is a war. And as much as people want to just say we can't do that, don't you, as someone who has knowledge of war itself, say you have to then take measures? You may not like them, you may choke on them, but you've got to keep yourselves and your family safe.
Ed, thanks for having me on. I do think that when you're at war, you certainly have to change how you think. I think that's probably the biggest problem right now, is we do need to change how we act, but let's start by changing how we think. You know, I really haven't seen anything in the last 14 years, Ed, that tells me that our policymakers and our senior leaders really understand the nature of this threat. We keep pulling out the same old tired playbook, and it's not working. And, you know, that's really what I bring out in my book, Game Changers. We've got to change how we think about this. And for starters, let's understand what ISIS and these other extremists want at a strategic level. We're playing right into it right now. And until we start thinking that way, you know, how we act is just going to be, it's going to be reactionary, and it's going to play right into their hands.
Is it possible, though, that we are playing into it when we have soft targets here at home? And I speak specifically about members of the military who are not allowed to carry their weapons in places where where the terrorists know they're at and know they sit there on a daily basis and just ready to be shot.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. We've got to harden, you've always got to try to harden your facilities. And again, this gets down to understanding what your enemy wants. Your enemy, in this sense, they are decentralizing. They are going local. They want to demonstrate that they can reach us in places like Chattanooga, not necessarily New York City. That's a whole new ballgame. But you know what, Ed, what strikes me? America, you know what makes us exceptional? Our communities, our level of trust historically has been so that if you tried something like that at a community level, it would be very difficult to do. And I think we've got to look at the strengths that we have in our society, which is our communities, our abilities to work together, and look at that as well as a strength, not necessarily a shortfall. I don't think we necessarily have to go to martial law or something like that. I think our communities actually can play a very positive role in this, but we've got to first, like your guest said, acknowledge the threat that we're facing and that they are actually an enemy.
It's a great idea, what you just talked about with community. So, Andrew, let me come back to you then, because this comes down to legalese as much as anything else. It's a great idea, but bringing a community together, my God, we can't even bring people together at a luncheon, for crying out loud, in this country anymore. Isn't that part of the ideology we've got to change here? We've got to change our way of thinking in how we protect ourselves, how we draw ourselves together and understand they're coming for us. And I'm not even trying to be hyperbolic here. This is another stretch of that evidence.
Well, Ed, we have a model that we know works, which is the one that was really developed, particularly after the 9/11 attacks, but the seeds of it even before, with this intelligence first. And I'm talking now about the domestic law enforcement level. The colonel obviously is much more competent to talk about the rest of it than I am. But we had an approach where law enforcement was basically charged to go in and beat the weeds in the places that we knew were hotbeds of the ideology.
But they're not allowed to beat the weeds anymore, and that comes down to a little bit of the civil liberties issue we're talking about. They can't do it anymore.
Yeah, it's precisely my point. I mean, the strategy now is that we're going to partner with these Islamic organizations, many of which are either parts of the Muslim Brotherhood or have relations with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a virulently anti-American organization, and make them our eyes and ears in the community. That cannot work.
Why?
We can't trust them to tell us what we need to know.
Okay.
And I think that's not just a shot at the Muslim Brotherhood. That's basic intelligence and law enforcement 101. You want information, you have to go get the information yourself.
There you go. And I wanted it said very, very succinctly, just like that. 45 seconds left, Lieutenant Colonel. So working off a little bit of what Andrew McCarthy said right here, whether it's overseas or whether it's here in America, do we need to take the brass knuckles approach?
Well, we're going to have to kill and capture some of these guys, Ed. That's never going to go away. Some of these irreconcilables, both at home, are going to have to be tracked down, and certainly in the safe havens in which they live. But what I want to point out here is, for the last 14 years, and I say this in my book, Game Changers, we have basically isolated this war in the shadows with spec ops, intelligence, and law enforcement personnel. We're going to have to bring the American people into this thing. They are coming for us. These types of attacks are going to continue. We got to get a victory garden mentality, although it's going to have to be adapted somewhat. This war affects everybody, the people in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and all over middle America. It's coming. It's not going away. We've got to step back, take a breath. We've been here. We've been in places where we're losing before. We just got to make some changes, and we can win this thing, but we've got to get serious about it, and it's going to take the American people's involvement to do it.
There was a time when the American people got together and realized that they were under attack. They gathered together, they put themselves out there, and they got themselves ready to fight the enemy. Andrew McCarthy,
Right.
Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann, thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. We appreciate your time. Stay with us. The Political Animal is next.